Okay. One sec here. Can everybody see the big slide? Okay, cool. So we're here to talk to you about the Applied Bachelor of Arts in Community Research and Evaluation. It's a new degree for Okanagan College, and there's lots of excitement from all of us and I think other faculty and staff at the college. So before we get into kind of a framework around one of the many social issues you could be exploring within the context of this degree, we just want to touch on a few points about why you might want to take this new thing that we're offering. So this is quite a unique program, and a part of the uniqueness is the applied nature of it. So the point is to have you learn lots of skills and gain lots of knowledge that you can then use in a workplace or to go on to graduate work. So you'll have an opportunity to explore social issues from a variety of disciplines, which gives a much more well-rounded idea of what these things are that are happening in our world. We have multidisciplinary understanding of various social issues. We have lots of focus on applied research skills so that you can go out and do your own research and fieldwork. Building knowledge and skills leading to meaningful employment and also contributing to your community. And one of the unique aspects of this degree relating to my field of social work is that there is a pathway that you can pursue a Master of Social Work program at UBC Okanagan in their 2-year program. And they're actually reserving spaces for this degree graduates, as well as some specific spaces for Indigenous students who are graduates of this degree. And I think at the end, there'll be lots of opportunity to ask questions. So if you have any of those, we will be happy to answer them as best we can.
So as we were talking about this session this evening, Olivia had a fantastic idea to select a topic that was sort of relevant in terms of what's in the news these days, kind of important social issue that we could speak about from our different disciplinary perspectives. And the opioid crisis is, I guess, a really good example of a profoundly concerning social issue that you can evaluate from a number of different perspectives. The opioid crisis, unfortunately, has been with us for a very long time. To provide some context for 2020, I mean, this was a challenging year for everyone, but it was particularly problematic for those grappling with opioid addiction. So opioid overdoses are well-recognized concern in our communities. In 2020 in BC, over 1,700 people died from drug-related toxicity. So just to put that in context, it represents almost 5 people per day, and that figure is 8 times higher than the overdose fatality rate was a decade ago. So over the last year, so in 2020, from January to December, 61 people lost their lives in Kelowna, 281 in the Interior Health Authority. There are obvious personal costs, clearly. When we think about how our social structures work as well, you know, in 2020, the cost to the healthcare system was also pretty dramatic. So you can see the paramedic response rate was quite high in 2020 and represents a stark increase from earlier years. So with emergency health services responding to over 70 overdose calls a day on average, burnout is a real issue. And then that has downstream impacts on subsequent response times for overdose incidents, other health emergencies, and in the context of the pandemic, that's really, really concerning. Olivia, if we could maybe move on to the next slide and I can talk about the 2019 overdose rate. I teach a drugs and behavior course in 2nd year, and every year we go through the fatality rates for opioid overdoses. Most drug-related toxicities involve opioid exposure of some type. And 2019 was the first year in which we saw a decline in the fatality rates, you know, since 2010. This had been a growing problem, but with the widespread availability of naloxone or overdose reversal kits and the promotion of their use, we finally saw positive effects of these harm reduction strategies. So 2019 was a year in which we started to feel optimistic about those gains. Unfortunately, they've been effectively erased by the impacts of the pandemic on harm reduction and other public health services, which was deeply saddening thing to see this year, really. So if you're wondering about this as a cumulative, a time series graph for fatality rates from 1994 to 2020. And so it tracks both the absolute number of deaths and also the rate per 100,000 population. And so you can see that in 2019, which is the second to last bar, there was a decline, which again was a very hopeful sign. And so it's upsetting that obviously the pandemic has had that kind of effect on our response to the opioid crisis. So just from the perspective of how psychology might evaluate these sorts of things as a discipline, we tend to be, I think, a little bit reductive about things. So we look at things at the level of the individual. One of the things that we evaluate is the effect of drugs in the central nervous system, and then also individual responses to drugs. So one thing we spend some time talking about are the effects and toxicities of various sorts of psychoactive drugs. In terms of the crisis with drug-related toxicities in British Columbia, most of the overdose deaths involve fentanyl, and in just a minute we'll have a graph demonstrating that over 80% of drug-related fatalities involve fentanyl exposure. So, one of the concerning things has been the introduction of carfentanil, which is a much more potent form of fentanyl or analog of fentanyl. It depends on the study you read, but it's anywhere from 20 to 100 times more potent than fentanyl. And it is being detected in a worrisome proportion of drug samples taken from various health authorities. So about 10% of the overdose fatalities in 2020 in the Interior Health Authority were associated with carfentanil concentrations of a lethal level. The issue with fentanyl exposure is that often it's what we call inadvertent. So fentanyl is frequently in drugs, illicit drugs purchased on the street, is frequently combined with at least one other psychoactive drug. Most of the time, people may believe that they're buying a stimulant like cocaine, and they may not be aware that it has been adulterated with fentanyl. In a little bit, we'll talk about how potent fentanyl is. It is quite addictive, and so from the perspective of someone who's manufacturing illicit drugs, it is appealing because it makes the drug more addictive or dependence producing. So it generates more customers for you. Unfortunately for the user, inadvertent exposure can prove to be fatal. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we discuss combining an opioid with a stimulant. So with inadvertent exposure, one of the most common combinations actually of fentanyl detected in overdose deaths is with cocaine. So people believe that they're ingesting cocaine, but they're actually ingesting fentanyl as well. And, obviously not being prepared for it or having harm reduction interventions at hand, that can prove to be a fatal combination. Other drug users do purchase fentanyl knowing that it's fentanyl. They may not be aware that fentanyl is adulterated with other substances like carfentanil, which is more potent and may result in a fatal overdose. In December, some of you may remember in the popular media, there were warnings from health authorities regarding adulterated fentanyl, to which benzodiazepines had been added. The synergistic effect of those two drugs can well prove to be fatal. So in December, that was the most common cause of drug-related, or one of the more common combinations related to drug toxicities. So I think that is probably all that I'll say at the moment. I'll just mute myself.
Hi, all. From a sociological perspective, we tend to kind of move back and look at a bigger picture. And so in that way, psychology and sociology are extremely compatible, and we overlap in many ways. And certainly, once psychology begins to look at kind of, the social indicators and risks, that's where we start to head more into kind of my territory in sociology. And in sociology, we also try and connect that bigger perspective, what we call the macro perspective, with, okay, how does this big picture then affect people's everyday interactions in their everyday lives? And so this is where we kind of head more into a kind of sociology of the individual. or a micro perspective. And so that's what I do in my classes quite a bit. In terms of the big picture, we tend to focus on things like culture, so cultural factors. If we're looking at marginalization, for example, there are certain groups within our society that are treated unequally. They have been marginalized over the course of decades. For First Nations people have been marginalized pre-Confederation of Canada, right? So at first contact with European settlement here on what we now call Canada. And so how does that history of colonialism, for example, affect First Nations people in these different ways? And of course, substance abuse and addiction is one of those ways in which First Nations people are overrepresented. And when we talk about overrepresentation in anything, what we tend to do is we look at what is the overall representation of First Nations Aboriginal people within the population. And then to what extent are these same groups represented in terms of this social problem? So right now we're talking about the opioid crisis, but we could be talking about housing, we could be talking about access to safe drinking water, or we could be talking about education, employment, any one of those kind of bigger issues and bigger topics. So if we look here at First Nations, we can see that there were several flags that were alerted from behalf of Aboriginal communities in terms of, hey, you know, this is happening in our communities and this is a problem and people are dying and people are, you know, becoming fastly addicted to this very fast killing substance. So as early as 2014, and of course, as Stephanie says, the opioid crisis is not new. It's been going on for, you know, quite some time. And especially in terms of opioid-related overdose deaths on reserves in Southern Alberta. And that's the other thing too, when we're talking about First Nations, we need to be aware whether we're talking about on reserve numbers or off reserve numbers. And so this is also something that we teach in terms of how to read research, basically. Like, where is this data coming from? Who exactly are we talking about? Where is the source? Is it a government source? Is it a community source? Just so that we are familiar with, you know, the information that we're using and we're comfortable about, you know, what it represents and how it's been interpreted. So with First Nations communities, it's really important to know whether you're talking about on reserve or off reserve. And the issue around any kind of research with First Nations is that usually when you're talking about Stats Canada, or we're talking about Health Canada or those kinds of numbers, we're talking about off reserve numbers, because to gain access to on reserve data is more difficult. And so the kind of default then is to look at off reserve numbers. So just kind of a quick caveat. So reports published by both BC and Alberta have highlighted the impact of the opioid crisis on First Nations communities. And of course, we're looking at a bit of a dated data set here. So from 2016 to 2017, but just to say things have not improved, okay? And certainly, as was mentioned with the pandemic, you know, there are overall stress factors. There's, you know, a heightened unemployment rate. There's all kinds of domestic, you know, issues with people having to stay at home and so on. So both BC and Alberta have found similar findings in terms of the ways in which the opioid crisis impacts First Nations communities. They're 5 times more likely than their non-First Nations counterparts to experience an opioid-related overdose, and 3 times more likely to die from an opioid-related overdose. Men and women were almost equally likely to experience an overdose event, and First Nations women were more likely to die than non-First Nations women, who represented less than 30% of non-First Nations deaths. And so this is another trend that we often see when we're talking about not just First Nations, but Aboriginal communities in general. And so First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities as well, where whatever is happening in the non-Aboriginal world, it's worse in the Aboriginal world. So this could be addiction, this could be domestic violence or interpersonal violence, this could be sexual assault, this could be homicide, this could be you know, use of force, encounters with the police. I mean, you know, this is the overall trend. And so there has been a lot of talk at the level of government in terms of, okay, how do we deal with these issues that are disproportionately impacting First Nations communities. And so that's the other thing we look at in sociology is what is the response from the different social institutions? And so what is the response from the federal government, for example? And how does that trickle down into political governments, or how does that trickle into social policy changes or legislative changes? Or is there an issue with, okay, the legislation's fine, but it's the way the legislation is being implemented, right? And so again, taking those experiences of those community members and then reeling back and looking at the bigger picture and saying, okay, because this is a crisis, that means that it is required that we make fundamental changes to the way our society is organized and to the way our society is run. And so whenever you're talking about fundamental changes, then you're talking about changes that each social institution needs to make in order to remedy the situation. So there's a lot of talk in terms of, the federal government, especially when it comes to First Nations communities and Aboriginal communities, treating the opioid crisis as a criminal justice issue, when it is not a criminal justice issue, it is a health issue, right? And so therefore there is a shift in political perception and political will, as well as within the general public in terms of perception, that we now start treating addictions as a health issue. And we also implement harm reduction strategies right now. Okay, so, perhaps, it is very popular to tell the public that, okay, we're going to stop this crisis right now. We're going to stop everybody from taking drugs because drugs are illegal, at least opioids, right, on the street are illegal. But it's quite another thing when you're talking about, lives of people and how that is actually possible in terms of addictions, treatments, and interventions. And so things like safe injection sites become critical. Things like, harm reduction strategies where perhaps stopping drug usage is not possible, but maybe lessening it is the best thing that we can do right now, right? Can I see the next slide, please, Olivia? So again, we're just comparing Alberta and BC. So again, it's important to look at Canada as a whole and then look at different communities who live in Canada, as well as the differences in provinces. Of course, when we're talking about First Nations communities, it is the prairie region that we see that is more impacted by these issues than, say, in the East or in Ontario. Oftentimes we compare Alberta and BC because we're right next door to each other. And so there are certain distinctions. So for example, if you see in BC, First Nations males are more likely to die than females from an opioid-related overdose. In Alberta, First Nations people were twice as likely to be dispensed an opioid as non-First Nations individuals. And so again, we also have to look at the medical community. How is the medical community treating First Nations patients? Is there a unequal standard of care? Is there a sort of reaction by the medical community to just kind of like throw drugs at the problem instead of treating First Nations communities in depth and comprehensively and holistically. Can I see the next slide, please? And again, right, I'm trying to I'm just scratching the surface here, but I'm trying to give you an overview of, how different groups become overrepresented and how different groups become differently impacted. So if we look at people experiencing homelessness, of course, the opioid crisis has hit the homeless community especially hard. And of course, Vancouver and the East Side, downtown East Side neighborhood of Vancouver is a peak hotspot for the opioid crisis. So Vancouver, BC is undergoing overlapping overdose and housing crises. So again, in sociology, we don't just look at one particular issue. We look at how those risk factors and issues overlap and intersect. So for example, someone who is addicted to opioids or being impacted by the opioid crisis, they will be experiencing that in a certain way, depending on, their social background, their history, whether they are a member of a marginalized group, but also, for example, a First Nations person will be impacted by the opioid crisis in a particular way, but a homeless First Nations person will be impacted in a particular way that's different because of the contributing factor of homelessness on top of the fact that they're engaged with opioid usage. So over 30% increase in homelessness since 2014. So again, looking at economic drivers, right? So what leads people to being homeless in the first place? Is it mental health? Is it unemployment? Is it, fleeing from violence? What is it? And in order to ultimately, right, sociology tends to be that long-term project. We tend to have our eye on the ball long-term. How do we remedy these social problems in the long term? Then these are the issues we need to address, okay? So in BC, data collected by emergency departments found unstable housing reported by approximately 30% of those presented for a known or suspected overdose, and by almost 50% of young people aged 13 to 18 years of age. So if we're talking about youth, for example, that's another risk factor. So why would youth between those ages find themselves homeless, right? We know that in Toronto, for example, the #1 cause of youth homelessness is, or of LGBTQ youth homelessness, is being kicked out of the house after, coming out to their parents and so on. We also know that First Nations youth can leave on reserve homes and run to urban centers thinking that their life could be improved, or seeking excitement or whatever, right? And so again, these are all risk factors that we need to take into consideration to understand exactly socially, culturally, what is happening here in this crisis. Can I see the next slide? Prisoners is a whole other population. Of course, when we're talking about the prison population, again, Black Canadians are overrepresented in the prison population. They make up about 3% or 2.8% of the Canadian population, but they're represented about 8% in the federal prison population. Aboriginal people are way overrepresented in the prison system. They make up about 4% of the overall Canadian population, but in certain federal penitentiaries, for example, in the Prairie region, their representation can be upwards of 60% of the prisoner population. There were recent reports published by the the Correctional Investigator's Office, which actually said that the criminal justice system is becoming indigenized, right? The fact that there's so much overrepresentation of First Nations people and Aboriginal people in our prison systems, this has reached crisis levels. And so the federal government is called upon by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, by the Office of the Correctional Investigator to take this seriously and to take structural systemic measures, changes to solve this problem. And of course, drug usage is one of those risk factors that set people up for a future in prison, potentially, right? Your risk of experiencing incarceration increases if you are a drug user. And so again, there is access to fentanyl and access to opioids within our prisons. So that is something that as a society we need to deal with. How does it get in there? But also, what are the kinds of programs available for addictions counseling and rehabilitation within our prisons? There seems to be, throughout the early 2000s, this kind of tough on crime approach, which basically pushed the punitive perspective of corrections, right? That people go to prison to be punished. And so therefore they shouldn't have access to educational programs. They shouldn't have access to rehabilitative programs. They shouldn't have access to counseling. They shouldn't have access to vocational training. They shouldn't have access to any of those things because they are prisoners. But again, on the other side, when we look at people coming out of prison and going into prison, the numbers are exacerbated by the fact that there is no programming, or there is not enough programming within our prisons, and people are continuing to die even within prisons. And so we can start talking about, okay, well, what about safe injection services within our federal prisons, right? What about, which is a federal government, jurisdiction, but then how do we deal with that within our provincial jails? How do we deal with that within our detention centers, which are governed within a municipality, right? And so there's all kinds of levels to deal with. So basically sociology kind of looks at all of that, that big picture stuff. Each social institution, the government, the criminal justice system, the economy, so things like housing, employment. We look at education, access to education, What is the education department doing to educate people of the crisis, to talk to students about the crisis, to raise awareness? What are we doing at the level of family in terms of intervening in those unhealthy domestic environments that would be a risk factor for drug abuse, or drug abuse that is happening within family dynamics? And so a lot of this boils down to what are the calls for action? How can we understand this crisis? How can we understand this problem from the different facets of institutions, as well as social groups and our history of marginalization of certain groups within our country, as well as, what are we going to do about that as a systemic level in terms of systemic discrimination, systemic racism within our institutions. And of course, with all that, with the goal of ending the crisis at some point.
Thanks, Priscillia and Steph. I'm just going to tweak how I'm sharing because I realized that I can't see my notes on the other screen if I have it open. So is everyone still seeing the slide okay? Okay. So it's really neat hearing from the other disciplines because I feel like, we're all so interconnected and have different areas of strength. So in social work, we really benefit from research from a lot of different disciplines, and social work has their own stream of research, but we kind of pull together from sociology, from psychology, from lots of different disciplines to do a lot of the action steps. So often people think social work is just about child protection, and I'm here to tell you that isn't inaccurate. Thank goodness. But depending on what level of social work you're working in, you're going to be looking at different aspects of the research, a different focus on potentially more of the individual or more of the structural factors that you've been hearing about from Steph and Priscillia. So we pulled together the research, and then in the example of the opioid crisis, we would be looking in a direct practice setting, which is really like what we often think of as traditional social work, sitting down across from another human and talking to them about what's going on in their life. And one of the things we look at is meeting the person where they're at. So looking at, what's happening for you, what do you have going for you, what are some of your strengths, what are some of your challenges, and just trying to provide that sense of dignity and solidarity with the people that we work with. You'll also hear in social work about what we call the person and environment perspective, which really just means looking at a person within the context of their life. So that can be social connections, that can be the reality of this person maybe is homeless or in prison, looking at what's beyond the individual that might be impacting their situation. And then also structural factors relating to the person's circumstances. So much of what Priscillia was just highlighting around social location, social conditions, how do all of those things impact this person that's sitting in front of me if I'm working in a direct practice situation. We also have a lot of social workers who are engaged in policy work, which is really interesting and a huge area we need to be pushing in terms of social justice, in my humble opinion, looking at what do we need to change in order to prevent or mitigate this issue. So what can we take from the research to actually create some change so that people aren't in these circumstances anymore? And a big part of social work is around advocacy. We have in our BC ASW Code of Ethics that we're one of our main jobs as social workers is to advocate change in the best interest of the client and also for the overall benefit of society. So you see that connection between individual and structural, even within our Code of Ethics. So some of this you've heard about already in terms of what we know from the research. I had big plans to have all sorts of citations for you here and obviously failed at that because there are actually just so many that this would have taken us, an entire semester. So you're just gonna have to trust me. What do we know from the research is that people who are experiencing addiction have very high rates of trauma. And often that's where people stop their analysis is this person is a traumatized individual without considering even the sociological context of who traumatized them, right? So it's often this person is in isolation, which we know is not accurate and doesn't really serve them either in terms of treating that. So often people who've been through traumatic experiences, that trauma hasn't been acknowledged or it's been badly acknowledged, which sometimes is actually worse than the traumatic incident in itself if you, for example, aren't believed or you're dismissed when you do tell. And then that means that a person's trauma might be unresolved or unprocessed and therefore is really influencing what they're doing from day to day or how they're feeling about themselves and the world. We also know trauma occurs within the context, social context of oppression. So whether that's misogyny, colonization, homophobia, all the isms that you can think of, those things all relate to a person's experience of trauma. And so we really try and connect those dots so that we're not just looking at a person and the ways that they're sort of quote unquote failing at life. We're looking at what brought you to this point in your life and what can we do not only to help you, but to prevent it from happening to other people. In terms of harm reduction, we also know from the research that harm reduction saves lives. Like, I feel like that's enough said, end of story. But that is over and over again, it's found in the research that harm reduction saves lives. And one of the ways we've found that is from the safe injection site called Insight, which a lot of you probably have heard about in Vancouver, the downtown east side. That was the first safe injection site in all of Canada, and they've done quite a bit of research from that site specifically around how it's benefited the people who use that service, so they can go in and access, clean needles, whatever they need to be able to safely consume their drug of choice that they bring into that setting. We also know from that research, as well as others, that harm reduction services benefit the surrounding community. So even for people who are concerned about, having needles laying around downtown, well, it actually shows that there's less of that. If you have a safe consumption site, there's somewhere to put them. People aren't having to share and save needles in the same way. Harm reduction services also reduce rates of overdose. We could also call that poisoning. One of my favorite academics is Vicki Reynolds, and she talks about it's actually political poisonings, because if the drugs were in the wine, we would have solved this problem yesterday. Preventing communicable diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. Well, there's huge health benefits, which, as was mentioned before, that has benefit not only to those people, but also to our social welfare system, where we're spending less money on things like ER visits and healthcare and ambulance rides. Perhaps most importantly, harm reduction services also provide people with dignity, which is a huge piece of social work when we're looking at how can we sit down with this person and afford them some dignity that they may not have felt in recent years. Safety and access to other services such as detox and addiction treatment. Again, that example of Insight, they have detox upstairs. They have referrals to treatment centers. So when a person comes in there, they're allowed to, use as you like if you want to. If you want to talk about some other services that we can help you access, then that's also available. So that's really important. We also talk a lot about how we can translate that research into policy change. So you've heard some of these already. Decriminalizing personal amounts of illicit substances is on a lot of people's radar right now. It would save police having to arrest people for small amounts of illicit substance. And it also helps people feel more able to access support services without that stigma that's associated, or that criminal element, right? Like Priscillia mentioned, looking at it more of a health issue than a criminal issue. We can use the research to advocate for policy change around having more safe consumption sites, connecting people to support services, even, shocker, the idea of having publicly funded mental health services, publicly funded trauma treatment supports, making that just normalized. Lots of places do it. We could be next. And just providing citizens with access to basic needs, like some of these things that have such a direct connection to a person's addiction, like housing, like food, clean water, having enough money to be able to pay for the key things that they need in their life. So we kind of worked together to pull this all together with a case study, and then we'll just touch on a few questions from each of our disciplines, and then we'll have time to answer your questions. So we thought this might be a suitable one to look at some of the issues we're talking about. Joshua is a 25-year-old Caucasian cisgendered male living in Kelowna. He was prescribed opioids at age 18 after a serious car accident that left him with chronic back pain. His best friend was killed in the collision. After quickly developing a dependence on the painkillers, it's remarkable how quickly people become dependent on opioids. He was continually prescribed this medication for 18 months, and then his doctor cut him off. So he turned to a street supply to medicate his pain and growing dependence. By age 20, he's homeless. And due to an understandable mistrust of medical professionals, he's reluctant to seek support services, including safe housing, medical services, and mental health support to deal with his depression, trauma, and grief from the accident. Joshua has overdosed on the street twice, been revived by naloxone. However, with an increasingly toxic supply of street drugs, he worries next time naloxone may not work. He feels alone and hopeless. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Olivia, and I really appreciate that case study. I think the questions we ask in psychology often are quite basic ones. One question I find people often have about opioids is why they're addictive and why it is that sometimes chronic opioid users can experience a fatal overdose. And there's a relatively straightforward answer to that question. So the reason that opioids are so addictive is part of the reason why they're prescribed as analgesics or pain medications, and that is that when synthetic opioids bind to opioid receptors endogenously within the body, they inhibit neural signaling, and so they inhibit pain signals. So they often will mitigate chronic pain issues. The challenge with that is that they inhibit all neural signaling. And one of the interesting things when you look at brain function is that there's a particular circuit in the brain that we think is responsible for our experience of pleasure and reward. And that is a circuit that is heavily populated with what we call dopamine containing neurons. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that these neurons use to send signals. Most of the time that mechanism has the brakes on. So dopamine isn't freely available in the system and is only released in certain circumstances that make us feel that rush of pleasure or reward. You inhibit all neural signaling. One of the things you inhibit is the braking mechanism. So if you inhibit the brakes, you take them off the system and you have this intense rush or flood of dopamine availability, which feels, as some people describe it, like nothing else they've ever experienced in terms of the level of pleasure or reward. And that is what's considered to be the most sort of addictive component of opioids. The more potent the opioid, the more potent the effect. That becomes problematic when the inhibition of neural signaling spreads from some of those circuits to others that are more essential for life-sustaining functions. So when inhibition spreads to brainstem areas that are responsible for respiration, that's usually when you have a fatal event related to opioid exposure. And this is what we think happens when people have inadvertent exposure to fentanyl or other drug combinations that result in fatality. So for example, if you ingest cocaine, it's a stimulant, it increases neural signaling. Its half-life is much shorter than an opioid. So somebody may seem fine initially because they have a stimulant in their system as well as fentanyl, let's say. The stimulant is counteracting fentanyl, but it's metabolized much more quickly. And once it leaves the system, the inhibition related to the opioid or fentanyl spreads, depresses respiration, and that's when you have a kind of fatal overdose effect. So the dangerous aspect of opioids is also what we think makes them particularly addictive. Given their addictive properties, and then also Olivia and Priscillia beautifully articulated many of the individual and structural risk factors for addiction. Once you have a coping mechanism that delivers a kind of numbing experience, a rush of pleasure in a life that otherwise may be characterized by all sorts of intractable structural barriers to well-being, it's not surprising that someone might find themselves in that kind of, it can feel like a never-ending treadmill of using a drug, becoming dependent on a drug, and then needing to continue using the drug to avoid entering a withdrawal state, which for opioids feels like it will kill you. It is an unbelievably physiologically and psychologically distressing experience. So it's the cycle of addiction is one that is inculcated quite readily with opioids, and it's easy to understand how it is perpetuated across time. What we know about individual treatments for opioid addiction, at this point, actually, the data can tell us quite a lot about that. And again, as Olivia and Priscillia have noted, we like to return to data when we can to inform the decisions that we make in terms of individual treatment, and then also the kinds of decisions we make as a society. And that is usually the most effective way to make decisions, because we're most likely to make decisions that are going to be helpful if we base them on data or what evidence is telling us. Harm reduction strategies are well established in terms of their effectiveness, but they're not intuitive. So if somebody is addicted to an opioid, your first impulse is not necessarily to provide them with more of that opioid. But we know from research studies actually stretching back to the late 80s in Europe, in Switzerland, it became evident to both legal and healthcare professionals that harms related to heroin use were concentrated in a relatively small group of individuals who were addicted to heroin and who were supporting their addiction through various sorts of socially costly behaviors. So things like theft, just as an example. It can become, when you look at addiction to a drug that is illicit, it can become a much broader problem than the issue of addiction itself. Addiction can be an indicator of all sorts of risk factors that lead into addiction, and then managing the addiction can generate all sorts of other social problems in both the healthcare and the legal systems. And those problems are most importantly costly to the individual, but they're also costly to society. So in Switzerland, the notion anyway was, well, this is costing everyone a whole lot. What if we provide people with a safe supply of the drugs to which they're addicted? They did that and monitored the outcomes, and they found, not surprisingly, that if you provided heroin to heroin users, the costs associated with legal issues and then also healthcare costs plummeted. Surprisingly, or counterintuitively, they also found that heroin users would use less heroin if they had a predictable supply. If you don't know where your next fix is coming from, you're going to use as much as you can to make it last for as long as you can subjectively. If you know that you can count on another dose, you will start to titrate your dose, and you actually may wean yourself back a little bit in your dosage. Studies in the downtown east side, so Olivia mentioned Insight. We know that people who use Insight are also more likely than those who don't to try detox and become engaged with treatment. We also know from associated studies, the Naomi study, so the North American Opiate Medication Initiative, and then the Salome trial, so the study to assess longer term opiate medication effectiveness. I think they're big acronyms, but they assessed the effect first for Naomi of providing heroin to heroin users. Dosages decreased in that study. The Salome trial, anticipating some of the political issues that you might encounter providing an illicit drug to drug users, evaluated the efficacy of hydromorphone, which is a heroin analog that is on the formulary, so is not illicit. The benefits were about the same as for heroin. So we know from the evidence that providing an analog of heroin or an injectable opioid will decrease healthcare costs, will decrease legal costs, and will also decrease the dosage that someone is taking. And practically speaking, following along with Olivia's and Priscillia's comments, what we can think about doing with individual treatment is keeping someone alive and preventing drug use from interfering with the other kinds of intervention that they may need to deal with what are usually multiple really significant issues that they've been grappling with for a very long period of time. So this is sort of what we know from the data, and I'll turn it over to Priscillia and Olivia for further questions and discussion.
Hi, yeah, so taking from a psychological perspective, moving into sociology, again, in Joshua's case, for example, right? He's a 25-year-old Caucasian cisgendered male living in Kelowna, right? So he's not readily identifiable as someone coming from a marginalized group. So he's not First Nations, he's not trans, he's not part of the LGBTQ community, he's not a person of color. And so then the question is, okay, well, what is the risk factor here? What is the social factor, the social determinant that's bringing Joshua to opioid usage? And then, of course, quite quickly, we realized that he was prescribed opioids by his doctor and then developed an addiction and was cut off. And the root of the addiction seems to be not just the physical pain that he experiences, but also the loss of of course, his friend and the trauma of the car accident, and perhaps, the guilt he might be feeling as a survivor of that, and all of that. And so one thing I will say about cis males is the way masculinity is constructed within our society discourages men from actively seeking out therapy and talking about trauma and acknowledging feelings, and admitting that they're struggling. And so that's from a sociological and from a gender perspective, that would be one of the things that would be included as a risk factor in Joshua's case in particular. Now we know that there are all kinds of other social determinants that have been identified in terms of drug addiction and drug usage, and not just the development of an addiction, but also the continuation of drug use, as well as the different opportunities for treatment and rehabilitation, and also people's willingness to access those programs. So again, in Joshua's case, there seems to be a mistrust of the medical community. And so what other community options are there available? In terms of criminal justice, and I don't know, Joshua may very well encounter in the criminal justice system at some point. And it's a high probability that he will, being a person who is a drug, who uses drugs and who also lives on the street, who is homeless. However, in terms of policing, right, it's really important that our law enforcement is trained on how to deal with people who are, experiencing a drug, who is high on drugs, right? And so having to approach this person who they know is intoxicated, how that person is handled, how that person is controlled, how that person is brought into custody if that's necessary. All of that training is really crucial for law enforcement, because we don't want to see, and this is unfortunately especially a trend in the communities of people of color and the First Nations specifically, where law enforcement are reverting to use of force measures in their encounters with intoxicated people. And of course, we don't want that to happen. We also don't want, Joshua, for example, to be in a situation where, he doesn't trust the medical community, and then there's no other source of treatment around for him, right? So there's no community resources, there's no social supports, in terms of somewhere he could go and find that help without having to go back to the medical community for help if he doesn't trust that, right? Oftentimes we think that, if we were to distribute our money differently, we could be making, as policymakers, as governments, as just people in the general community, holding our governments accountable for those kinds of budgetary decisions. If we were to distribute that money differently and invest more into the communities, right, in terms of providing services, in terms of dealing with those risk factors at the community level, we would see a lot less call, for example, police having to be brought into the scene, or we'd see a lot less demand for spaces within our prison system, right? Because we can deal with these things effectively, and law enforcement in the criminal justice system, for example, are just not equipped to deal with these issues. That's not their intent. That's not what they were established for. And so we need to be building up these community services for people. And in terms of, systemic discrimination and so on, not only is Joshua, probably having to deal with being a man and keeping it all together, being a young man, and having to deal with this intense trauma in a way that's kind of stigmatized, but also drug users in general are stigmatized within our society. The idea that, it is not seen as a disease, it is not seen as a health issue, it is seen as a moral issue, it is seen as a criminal justice issue, it is seen as an issue of willpower, or it is seen as an issue of individual responsibility and accountability, when of course we know that that is not accurate and there's much more involved. And so, I could go on, but I'll stop there.
I'll be quick because are we gonna get cut off at 7, or we're okay? Okay. So apologies. I was trying to move my notes to find them again, and then I lost them again. Okay, we're back on the slide. Sorry, everybody. All right. So in social work courses, I use a lot of case studies because I think it's a great way to use your knowledge that you've gained and apply it to an actual situation you might come across in practice. So often the first comment from students is like, I don't have enough information, which is always going to be true. So there's so much of Joshua's life that we don't know about. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that we're never the expert on someone else's life. So contextual factors we would look at for Joshua to really understand his experience would be things like, where is he living? Who are his people? Who does he rely on for support? We know that a lot of people who are street involved have a great supportive network of who they call their family. So we can draw on those people potentially as strengths if he has them. Does he have contact with his family? What's that contact look like? What are those relationships? And are there any people we can kind of pull out of the woodwork to support him? In social work, we talk a lot about a strengths-based perspective. So trying to focus not only on what's deficient, quote unquote deficient in Joshua, what's wrong with him, but what's right with him and how can we use those things to further whatever his goals might be. So things like identifying ways in which he's keeping himself as safe as possible. What are you doing? Do you only ever use with your buddy? Things like that. Like we can say that's awesome, good for you. If someone's been living behind a dumpster for 3 years, they probably have a lot of life skills that I don't, and we can honor those things in a way that makes people feel heard and seen and lessen some of that stigma. In terms of individual and structural factors relating to Joshua's struggle with addiction, this could go on for days, so I won't. But in terms of individual things, we can look at that unresolved grief and trauma that he has, inability to have food security, lack of housing. He might have some self-esteem challenges. There could be all sorts of stuff from his childhood that we haven't even touched on yet. He might not have a connection to his family anymore. He might have strained social relations with others. So things that are kind of just focused on what's going on for him as an individual. And then when we look at structural factors, it's a lot of the things that have been raised already, but looking at what supports do we even have in our society to support someone like him to process his grief and trauma. Food security and housing are social issues that we've collectively decided not to address. With whoever we vote into power, those people are not ones who have so far been willing to do things like housing first policies or provide the supports that require the people need to have food security. So that's not just an individual blame situation. We need to be looking at a broader picture of that. Arguably our Western culture, since he's a Caucasian young man, our individualistic society doesn't really rely a lot on encouraging each other and that collective care that other cultures have in a much more powerful way. But we do know from lots of research and from all of our lives, I'm sure that we do need each other. We need relationships. Priscillia mentioned around gender roles. So absolutely, like he's going to be potentially in a situation where he's kind of had to stuff his feelings for a long time. And I'm sure many of you know that doesn't work very well. It's not very effective. And we also have social stigma about mental health and addictions as a moral issue instead of a health issue. And I touched on some advocacy efforts before, but on a micro level, that's kind of that individual level again. We could advocate for him to get into some housing that he might not even know about. So in social work, we talk a lot about what power we have, even just by virtue of knowing what's out there for supports and how we can share that power with people we're working alongside. Helping him get into a treatment program if that's what he wants, and respecting if that's not what he wants. Helping him with some of the paperwork that might come along with some of those things, connecting him to any services that might be beneficial. When we talk about that meso level, that's kind of like community, neighborhood. So encouraging his connection with the community he does have, seeking harm reduction supports within the neighborhood where he lives, educating police, as Priscillia mentioned, is a big piece of it, to engage with people who are experiencing homelessness. And again, that's arguably something that police aren't meant to be doing, but this is where we find ourselves presently. And then at the macro level, sort of more society level things, we can advocate for housing first projects, which we haven't really touched on yet, but the evidence really supports that, like, hey, guess what? If you give someone a roof, they do better in all the ways. And we can advocate for compassion and dignity for people experiencing mental health challenges and addictions. It used to be 1 in 10, right? I bet with COVID, it's much higher now of people who experience mental health challenges at some point in their life. All the policy recommendations that I mentioned before, and even things like a universal basic income. Our social assistance programs in terms of financial supports are pretty pathetic in BC. He'd be living off like $300 something a month as a homeless person without housing. So having something like a universal basic income might allow some of his stress levels to be reduced, where he could access other supports, other services, and get himself into a position that he can't possibly get into in his current state. So in terms of what kind of field placements could potentially be an option in this degree, this is just like a really small collection of opportunities that could be possible relating to this one issue. So we do have lots of options for field placements, but these would be a few that connect to the addiction issue. Some of them are Kelowna, some of them are Vancouver, and of course there's many more I'm sure that students can think of if they are interested in pursuing this degree in a field placement. And alongside the field placement is a capstone project. So we've given you a few just speculative examples of things that you could do for a capstone. And one of the really unique things about that project would be that you're getting to do some of your own research and contribute to that community, contribute to an issue that you're passionate about, and potentially provide something to an agency or a community that, that will be a real asset to their work. So I'll let you read them yourselves, and maybe we can just open it up for anyone who has questions about anything we talked about or anything relating to the degree itself. You can tell we're all fairly passionate about this, maybe. Is it helpful if I stop the screen share, or are people still reading? Or okay, stop.
If you could share what the degree is sort of looking like or rolling out like within Okanagan College, that'd be great.
So I think in September, most of the courses for third year will be available. All of the courses for first and second year are already available, except for a couple exceptions that we're working on. Sharon, if I'm wrong, please jump in. But so people can be starting up to and including some of the third year courses in September of this year.
It's Cheryl, was that your question, Cheryl?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Cheryl speaking.
Yeah, so you can email me more if you want more details on that, but Olivia is absolutely right. First, second, and third year, all of third year except for one course, and all of second year except for two courses that we can't see a way to get up.
And those two might be ones you can take elsewhere, right? And then have.
Yeah, that's what we're working on. You'll take them later.
Yeah.
So because it's not a cohort program, you don't have to go through the degree, you know, all of your first year, all of your second year, all of your third year. You can, depending upon where you're at with your prerequisites for different disciplines, you could be in first, second, and third all at one time. And with, you know, and you'll be with students in other programs at the same time. Yeah, and so there'll be more and more information forthcoming.
Great, thank you.
This is where I joke in my classes, did everyone go and walk their dog? Except for Cheryl.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm super interested in the political science aspect. I know we don't have any professor here today about political science, but you guys have any idea of like work field I could do in political science?
Any what? I just missed what you said about if there's something you can do in political science.
Yeah, related to this degree.
There are poli-sci courses in it, for sure. And I think one of the cool things about the capstone and field placement is it's going to be very student directed. So if you have a passion in a certain area and you want to focus more on the political side of that, there'll be room for you to do that within the capstone and the field placement.
But do you have any examples for like real jobs here in the community about political science, or is it related to any other course or something like this? Because I'm also interested in sociology, so I thought about both of them. I don't know if I can make something together, or it just should be one of it. I don't know.
Well, I know, yeah, Sharon, you can jump in. I know the city of Kelowna has opportunities for field placements, so I think and a lot of it is going to be kind of what you make of it. So if you have an area you want to look into.
Yeah, Olivia's right. It's really one of its benefits is it's really wide open, but one of its terrifying things is it's wide open and for students. So it really, if what you're interested in is poli-sci, there are a couple poli-sci courses in the program. But if that's your focus as you move into your field placement and your capstone project, you could work on political advocacy. Even if you're not working in a political setting, you might be working for an organization that really needs to be advocating politically, because they, often many social community groups just don't have the time or the resources to do that kind of work. And so you could go in as an advanced student with a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge and do that advocacy, at whatever level, local, provincial, federal. And, the other good thing, so I'm not sure if that really answers your question. There's no direct pathway to any one specific thing. The other thing too, though, about the field placement and the capstone is it doesn't have to be tied to Kelowna. So if your home is somewhere else in Canada or somewhere else in the world, you can do your field placement somewhere else, because it's 15 credits altogether for field placement and capstone. So it's like a semester worth of study. So, and we do envision students will take that back where they want to be, take that field experience elsewhere if they wish.
I think the piece about being an asset to an agency too is that a lot of funding for nonprofits in particular is contingent on not doing political efforts and lobbying and advocacy. So that would be an opportunity for a student to be, not getting paid, sorry, and you can be doing that work sort of on behalf of the agency, which is quite a cool opportunity, I think, because often agencies are kind of have their hands cuffed from doing that.
Mickey here, just to confirm what Olivia just said. I work in the not-for-profit sector, and certainly there is lots of opportunity there to look at that for sure.
Mickey's actually behind that.
That's really exciting to hear. That helped a lot. Thank you.
Awesome.
I thought this was fantastically interesting, and appreciate you guys so much for doing this. But I just want the students who are here, I think Danushi has your email addresses. If you have, I don't know if you have my email address, if Danushi has a way of getting it to you. If you have questions, so I work in the admin at the college. So some of you I've been in touch with already. But if you have like really sort of basic questions, you can just email me and I'll answer them for you. Rather, if you have questions about the discipline and the ideas, these are the folks to talk to, I think.
We could put
I can definitely send an email with everyone's email addresses, like Olivia's, Priscilla's, Stephanie, and Sharon's. Get that out to everyone.
Thanks, Tanushi.
That will help a lot. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Should we call it done? Are people ready to go, or is there there's time to ask questions if you want to just stick your hand up, or we can just log out and say goodbye. Wow, is this what it's like every day?